welcome everybody. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about scientific writing. And I kind of want to uh, kind of go through the parts of what I'm going to be focusing the talk, I should say, on a research paper. Okay, so how do we develop a manuscript for publication? What things do we consider? How do we synthesize all this research and data that we've been working so hard in the lab to get, right? How to make it publishable? So this talk will be basically focused on that, okay? And then in within the talk, we're gonna see a little bit about strategies on how to, for example, work on the grammar or strategies on how to build a good figure. So these things will also sometimes apply to presentations, for example, okay? So let's go ahead and start. So I want to start the presentation with learning objectives, because it kind of gives you an idea of what things I should be getting from this, right? The first thing we should be getting from this is to understand the definition of scientific writing and really to be able to see what is the difference between scientific writing and any other type of writing, right? Because there are different styles. So it's really helpful for us to understand what is scientific writing. The other thing that's very important is to be able to understand the purpose and why is it that we had to write in science, right? There's a lot of misconceptions that maybe a scientist, a PI, is working all the time in the lab, and that's not at all the case. Most of the time we're writing. So how does that writing look? That's one of the things, right? On that note, what are the parts that make a scientific paper, and what's the content of each part? So we're all being exposed to some degree to introduction and methods and conclusions, but what really is the questions that we have to answer within those sections? Also, I want to give you a bit of practical strategies. So practical strategies, because I can tell you what is supposed to go in each section, but how do I organize this months and months of data that I have, right? So some of those things will be included too. And I want you to familiarize yourselves with what the grammar and the style of this type of writing is. Okay. So basically, we want to take you from that spectator, the person that's reading the paper. And when we read a paper, we can easily criticize the work of others, right? But when it's our turn to write something, the blank page just stares back at us, right? So we want to take you from the spectator to the doer. How do we do that? We do it by answering, what am I writing? Why am I writing it? And how do I write it? And you'll see that the presentation is kind of focused on those three main questions. In order to understand scientific writing, we need to understand where did it originate from. And I'm a little biased because I do teach history of chemistry, so I included a little bit of history. So one of the first ways of humans, right, Neanderthals, to pass on knowledge was through the drawings in the caves, right? That was the very first attempt from us to just kind of communicate our lives or our experiences through something that would stay and prevail even if we were not there. So the first written records, right? First written records, cave paintings. Then we started developing the papyrus in ancient Egypt, right? And then from that point, now we start seeing that in those papyrus, the Egyptians start recording these recipes, right, that they used to make dyes. So the Egyptians were really good making dyes, and they were very good at extracting metals from ores. So all these things start being passed on a piece of paper and start putting knowledge into a way that we can communicate to others. Then along came the Chinese and invented paper per se, where we go ahead and just put all the knowledge. Now that knowledge was local because we can only take it so far, right? It's not until we start making the first published printing press, right, that we start disseminating and just kind of giving to everyone. the written knowledge that for centuries the civilizations have been recording. So we were starting recording it first at caves, then with the invention of paper, and then we had to disseminate it using the printing press. Interestingly enough, the first scientific journal, or not scientific but academic journal that was written in 1665, and that was the Journal of the Learned, or as you see here in the title, the Journal of the Scavans. Scavan meaning learning, right? So that's the first attempt to put into words, into paper, and disseminated what it was considered scientific knowledge, right? Things that we learned. So now that we know a little bit of the history, what per se is scientific writing? So scientific writing is a way to write that is technical, so it's highly specific to the audience that you want to communicate, and it's precisely communicate knowledge, but it's knowledge that has an expertise that is technical, right? That is scientific, okay? And that communication is done toward primarily a scientific audience. So right now there's kind of this euphoria or this boom with science communication for the public. And there's even degrees focusing on that, right? So strictly when I'm talking to you today about scientific writing to your peers, which in your case, everyone here is a scientist, so it will be to scientific audience. 3 things about scientific writing. First, your audience is other scientists. So please avoid describing general procedures or describing terms that everyone in the scientific community should know or is implicated to learn, right? You don't have to describe the scientific methods. We're scientists, we know what a hypothesis is, so that's something that you may not describe. What you should describe are things that are very specific to the work that you're doing. The general scientific knowledge will not cover it, right? The other thing, scientific knowledge should be concise and precise when you're writing it. So try to avoid any of adjectives. So sometimes even when I'm having to grade my students' papers, I see that they say a very shiny material. Okay, so you are communicating a characteristic of the material. But if you say a very shiny small material, small is ambiguous, right? Because what is small for me might not be small for you. So we want to avoid that kind of language and be as quantitative and as numeric as we can. So maybe instead of saying small, you could say a very shiny 2mm material. So that 2mm is 2mm. Doesn't matter who is reading it, right? Those kind of things we want to avoid. We also want to set our work within the context of other people's works. So we do science and we stand on the shoulder of giants, right? We build science from what the knowledge is already presented. So we want to acknowledge that. We do that through the references, we do that through co-authorship, and we do that through the section that says acknowledgements, right? So what is a scientific research paper? A scientific research paper is a collection of information that's clearly synthesized, it is concise, and it supports a main idea. What will be the main argument or your main idea? That will be your finding. So if you're saying that the sky is blue, I expect that research paper to have the data to support that the sky is blue, to explain why the sky is blue, and to explain it in a context of knowledge before that, okay? What it is not. A research paper is not a way to just dump information into a paper from multiple sectors and all the references in the world, some of them not even relevant, right? And it's not you cherry picking data or cherry picking references. What do I mean by that? So sometimes your finding might be something that is controversial and you only go ahead and pick up the references that support that part of the work. So that is not a research paper, right? That's just your opinion with selective facts that you look for. A good example of this is the many literature that there is on vaccines and autism, for example. So there's a portion of the people that think that vaccines cause autism based on their personal experiences, right? And some literature, mainly a paper from the New England Journal, well, that's very old and was disproven, by the way. And there's this other body of knowledge, right? Many references, many studies that outpass what these few other studies say, right? So it's not cherry picking this portion that supports your idea, it's looking at the whole, right? And making sure that your claims are evidenced and they're based on the work that's been done from others, right? Be very careful when you're writing a research paper of not including enough references or not reading seminal work. What does that mean? When you work in a field, scientific field, it will be your expertise, you're the expert on that, you're gonna learn other specific people that work with things that are similar to you. And you should be able to learn who is doing what by reading references, okay? Now, when you don't read enough references, you might be missing a paper that did something similar that you did, or something that could be useful to you, or they already did what you're proposing to do, right? So it's very important that we read enough of the literature so that we don't end up with a long article, but an article that's connected to other findings and scientific knowledge. So is everyone with me still? Because sometimes connection here is horrible. Yes?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, great, awesome. So let's go ahead and talk about the IMRAD story. So IMRAD. This is basically the way that the scientific community has agreed to format papers, right? So early journals used to publish studies that were more descriptive. You can think about this specific example of 1776, in which is basically a journal. It's a journal, right? It's a scientific journal, but it's publishing a dictionary of terms. Interestingly enough, this includes what people thought at the time were atoms, well, there were molecules, and all these types of definitions are within this article. So this article is not quite what we used to see now in the literature, right? Turns out that thanks to Louis Pasteur, after he came up with the germ disease theory, the section methods and how do you do experiments was very important because everyone wanted to replicate his experiments, right? So from the 19th centuries upwards, people started paying more attention into the reproducibility of the methods used by others. So science is important in the sense that it could be replicated by others. If your work is not reproducible, then there might be something wrong. There might be other factors that we're not thinking of because all these phenomena should be observed if we do everything exactly right. And for that, we have a method section in order for others to replicate our work. So from that point on, from the 19th century on, the scientific community agreed on having the following structure. Follow an introduction in which you will have the question or the problem, right? What are you studying? What is that contribution to the scientific knowledge, right? It will have the methods because we want to make sure that what you saw, we saw too if we were to do the experiments. In other words, is it reproducible? Then the other thing that you'll see in more modern journals is the results part, right? We want to see what were your observations, what do you find? Because then we want to see if we observe that too. And then the discussion. The discussion is the implications, the interpretation, and the knowledge of those observations. Is the new contribution to the scientific body, right? The explanation. Everything will be there condensed in the discussion session. And that's why it's a little bit harder to write. So good. So at this point, I know what a research paper is. I know how to write it. I know the sessions that it has. So challenge accepted. I'm ready to move on. Not quite. We're not yet ready to move on and write a scientific paper, right? Before the writing starts, magical things happen. And these magical things are very useful when you're writing. So first off, in order to write, you need to read. Don't blame me, that's just how it is, right? So because you'll be reading a lot, you need to have a way to manage those references. And for some students that might already know, others might not, there's a lot of references managers out there. But you can go ahead and keep a record of those references using references managers. So references managers will give you a list of the papers that you read, the information of those papers, and some, like Sotero, can allow you to make notes. So if a paper is particularly important to you because it has the sentences that you want to replicate, you can put that note there. If a paper is particularly important to you because it explains why you're observing a certain pH change, then you might leave a note. So that way you can go back and search for the references, and then you know what's the usefulness of that particular paper, right? Here I put a different reference managers. The most commonly known that are free are Mendeley and Sotero, but you have other ones that are paying, that you can pay for, and if you want to, that you can use. Also, before you start, have a record of your results, aka your notebook. That lab notebook has everything you have observed, everything that you have done, and it's very, very specific. Always put all the things that you've done, right? In my lab in particular, we have a way of doing the lab notebook. And my students will tell you that it's a little bit of a long document, very specific, but it's made so you have an organization, you can refer back to it. Mainly the important things in the document are your observations, that summary of your observations, what are those observations telling you, and obviously the data collected, because you need to keep a record of your results. Okay. Warning. That lab notebook should have all the observations, however insignificant you think they might be. This is especially important for reproducibility, because sometimes an experiment may go well, right? May give you an answer that you were looking for, but then when you try to reproduce it, it will never come back. Maybe it was that particular day, it was particularly humid, and that somehow had an effect, right? So however insignificant an observation might be, you should put that there. It's good notebook keeping. Before writing a paper, it's also very important to think about your story. The way that I force myself to think about the story is making an outline. And you see here a picture of kind of like an outline that I was thinking about. You see that I write a little bit of what the contribution is. So why should people even bother with the paper, right? What is it that is giving new knowledge? My hypothesis, for example, what do I think is happening and why it's happening? And then I had to make sure that the data that I collect supports that hypothesis and supports what I think is actually happening, right? And you see then later I start thinking about how does it look each figure, what things should I be considered. So it's important that you go through this process, because this process will be able to organize your thoughts, will get you thinking about your work, right? It will also help you organize the story you want to tell. And most importantly, it will tell you what data you need in order to support that finding, right? In order to evidence what you say you have found. Going back to that outline, it's very important that when you're doing that record keeping, you name the files in a way that are traceable. So for example, here's a format that we use in our lab. So if we're doing measurements, we tend to do our initials. The black will be the number of your notebook. The 13, which is in green, will be the page in which you had that procedure for that particular material. And then A will be if you have more than one sample. And it will get a little bit used to writing it, right? But it's a way that I can keep it traceable. I know the person that did it, I know in what notebook it is, and I know what page to find it. So it's a way to trace back all your results to it. That's something that I advise students to do. They don't always do it, but it's a good way to make sure that we can go back to the data if we need to. One of the most popular misconceptions is that you do your research and then you write. And that's not entirely true. In fact, I would advise you to never, never, never do your research and then write, because things might be lost along the way. You might not recall an observation, you might not recall something that happened that day. So I advise you to use writing as a way to manage your research. What do I mean by that? Going back to the outline. In the outline, you start having a story. You start identify the gaps. You start identifying what are the holes, what is the missing data, what are the missing materials. You start visualizing your paper. And in visualizing your paper, you're able to visualize your figures. So for example, you might notice, oh, I need the XRD pattern for all of these. Oh, but I don't have this one. So you start seeing what things are missing. So you might have to do more experiments, for example. One of the things that tend to miss a lot are the controls, because I don't know why usually students just do a lot of experiments and they forget about the controls. Controls are important. So mainly in this stage, a lot of people identify that they're missing controls. They might be having other ideas about how to organize the data or things to do. So it really allows you to identify what the manuscript needs, what experiments, and what things you need, what evidence you need to gather, right, to make your case. So it's a really good thing that to start doing these as you move along. Okay, so now you have been doing all this, you have been keeping records, you have been thinking about your research, reading, having an outline, identify the experiments. So what do we do? So now we need to get our story straight. That means that you had to have your main idea, that finding that you want to communicate, because that's scientific writing, right? Communicating a scientific finding. And then see what evidence supports it and make a case for it. How do you make a case for it? Using those references, right? So that's why it's so important that you organize it. This is when you start using the in-rep method. So you start thinking about, obviously, your title, which has to be concise and have keywords. And what I mean by keywords is not random words that may appear on your paper. It's words that directly signal people to your paper. So think about when you do a Google search of a paper. You have a question, you have something that you want to find out, and you write specifically materials, compounds, a molecule, and you're the most specific that you can, right? Your keywords should be specific to your work. Things like photochemistry. Well, photochemistry could be in homogeneous heterocatalyst or heterogeneous catalyst, right? So you don't want them to be too specific and you don't want them to be too ample, right? So it's really important that you really include those keywords that pertain to your work. Also, when you're doing your abstract, do it at the end, because as we know, it will summarize all your major elements. Okay. Introduction. The introduction is particularly important because it will give you context. So where is the field now? Why am I doing this? And where am I taking it? Where you're taking it is your contribution to scientific knowledge. Okay, what did I find and what is the implication of this? Then the materials, which I already talked about, it has to be in a way that is reproducible, right? The same with experiments. The results, sometimes people confuse or put results with discussion. It's good to have them separately so you define clearly what they are. When we're talking about results, it's the finding. You're not telling me what that finding, that observation that you saw is telling me. You tell me that in the discussion. The result will be your figures, your data points, right? The interpretation, the meaning of it will be in the discussion, okay? So it's good to have those two things separately, although some journals ask you to put them together, right? And the conclusion is basically a summary of these. It's very important, we'll see it later, but it's very important that the conclusion clearly states what's the contribution and the implications of what your work is, right? How is moving the field forward? What is adding to that scientific body of knowledge? Then you have the acknowledgement, right, and the references. So let's go ahead and dive into this. The title is the first thing that people read, is the thing that most people read, right? Not a lot of people read the abstract even. People decide whether they want to read your work based on the title. And that is important because you want to disseminate knowledge. You can only disseminate knowledge if people read your work, right? So you have to spend some time thinking about your title, right? It has to be captivating. Not too long, not too short. Please avoid things like investigation, evaluation, studies. We are doing scientific research. All of them are studies. All of them are investigations. That's what we do, right? So just try to avoid those waste words. The syntax is very important. So be careful of how you order those words. And you can even have a draft of different titles and just kind of pass it around and ask people, so you read the title, what do you think the study's about? To just give you an idea of what people think when they read that first sentence, right? It should be meaningful, concise, specific, and informative. And it should also capture the fundamentals of the nature of your experiments. Let's see some examples. So I want you to take a look at these and just kind of think about, what is the article about? What is the finding? Can you tell what the finding is? What's the method used? Can you tell something about the method? Is it specific? Is it concise? So that very first one, mechanism of suppression of non-transmissible pneumonia in mice induced Newcastle disease virus. Can you tell me about what the research is about? What is the finding for this type of work? I would say yes, right? I would say that what their contribution to the body of knowledge is that they're telling me about the mechanisms by which is suppressed the pneumonia in mice when it's induced, when you induce this disease by a virus. So it is informative. It's telling me about the finding. It's telling me what it's about. It's specific and it's concise. How about the next one? Evaluation, methylation status of the promoter of prostate apotheosis part 4 gene and its protein expression in Egyptian cancer patients. I would say it's informative, right? It's telling me, actually, I feel like it's telling me a little bit of too much information, right? This particular example is interesting because I know what they're doing, but I'm not quite sure what they're adding to the body of knowledge. So they're evaluating methylation status. So they're looking at what the status is. Why does that matter? How does it relate? So I feel like this title gives me more questions than answers. So I can't pinpoint the specific contribution for it. I do think it gives information, although I'm not sure if it's very concise, right? It's kind of long, actually. The last one, effect of sunlight on leaf morphology. Okay, the effect of sunlight on leaf morphology. Seems a little bit short. I'm not quite sure what they did. Did they study the effect? Did they study the mechanism of the effect? What's the morphology of the leaf? Did it change? Did it not change? Yes. Questions. I like questions. Go ahead, Amber.
Hi. I've always been told that basically the title, even for a poster, like it has to have like a type of a hook, like something to attract. Like even though example number 1 is pretty complete, I think it's missing that little bit of, like, I guess a way to hook you into the paper research, because as you said, like this is a very like ample, area, and you would need to have something that, like, I guess stands out. But I don't know, like what would be the specific tips for you to like have that type of consideration?
So that is a really good question, and I like where you're going because this is a more modern thinking. So what I'm presenting now, these criteria, is more like the classical thinking. But the more modern thinking is having like a catchphrase or something that just kind of sparks your imagination to captivate with your title. So things like pneumonia catch and kill, the mechanism of suppression. So it's more like glamorous, more like Hollywood, kind of like that hook that you're talking about, right? So that is, I think that's really, really good strategy, because when you're doing scientific writing, as you do with other types of writing, you want people to have interest. So yeah, for sure, you can add things like that. I'll give you an example. One of my recent presentations, we're trying to remove and destroy some compounds. So we say catch and kill, an approach to deal with this and that. So people respond to that, right? There's a really interesting paper about the use of graphene electrocatalyst, and I think the title says something about, does any crap you put on graphene increase catalytic activity, right? And those sort of things kind of get your attention. Maybe you don't need to go as extreme, so you can have some formality, right? But you can, yeah, definitely include those hooks. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So the introduction has to have a certain types of questions answered, right? What am I studying? Why is this an important question? Has anyone done this before? How does it been studied? What am I actually doing that is different from others? What is my strategy? It's basically tying what the knowledge or previous knowledge in the field is to what you're doing now. And I think the purpose of your work has to be very clearly emphasized and just described in one sentence. It should be there in your face, right? Because you want people to really understand right off the bat what is it that you're doing. Okay? So your strategy in studying whatever it is that you're looking at is very, very important. Materials and methods. There's a little bit of controversial debate here between the classical trained scientists and the more modern ones. Classical trained scientists, people that have been around the field for a long time, might tell you to not put a whole lot of details because you don't want people replicating what you're doing and then getting scooped. And they're very jealous about that. Well, more young scientists usually are more open to open access, are more open to sharing the data, more open to sharing their papers and their raw data, right? So there's a balance, and you have to decide which camp you are or where your advisor is, right? Personally, and this is personally, you might differ. I think that if we're doing something to advance science, we need to be transparent about it. And we need to put the details, and we need to make it so that other people can do it, right? Because ultimately you want your work to progress, and you want other people to use what you've done to advance knowledge. That's just a personal experience. So for this part, I really advise you to talk to your mentors and your PIs and see where they stand, just kind of grasp where they stand. What is really important to actually cover is that the experiments should be really clear, so that the peer review process is smooth, in the sense that they understand exactly what you did, and they can identify if there's any limitations to your techniques. You should organize those methods in subheadings. Do not put a whole lot of methods in just one paragraph, right? Just go ahead and break it down. Assemble of protein A and B. Characterization by this and that, protein A and B. So you can have an organized section for these. You do have to describe your experimental design, and it is written in past tense because you already did it. That's why you're publishing it, right? Other things to consider: it should be clear and it should be simply stated. Like I said, it should be in past tense. Most people, if they're not looking at what you have in your discussions, looking for specific information, they will look at your methods, right? And then from the methods, they will decide whether they look for the results. So in your results, you have to organize this in an orderly, logical sequence. It should be easy for your reader to find your findings. So this is best done using figures. We're going to go through that, okay? And then you should describe any methods that you have used. How can you present your results? Well, you can present it in a text, right? Written. You can present it in a table. And you have to be very careful with tables, because tables should convey a message real quick. If your table is enormous, it's not conveying an information real quick. And it should also, or you can also use a figure to do this. That's my personal favorite, because figures are always accompanied by a caption, and that caption should tell me what I'm seeing in that figure. And not just describing, this is the voltammetry for this and that. No, it should tell me the voltammetry of this and that shows blah, 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 right, in your caption. Good captions are really important to accompany figures because they allow them to stand alone, right? Never have a table or figure that is not mentioned in a text. This is very important because it does have to stand alone, but it can't not have an explanation to it, right? That's what's in the text. So every figure that you put in your research paper should have a purpose, right? The discussion is the hardest part to write, but it's the most important part to write, right? This is where you make the argument that what you found of your observations and your interpretations. So the primary purpose of this section is to really show that those relationships of the facts and really interpret that to your reader. This is why I think it's happening. This is why this is changing color. This is why I think I observed this. It has been proven, right? There has to be a tie to literature. So this has been observed before. Or it could also be in a way that literature has observed this. However, we observed that, and we believe it's because of this, and then have an evidence to back it up, right? That could also be something that you write in a discussion session. Because sometimes in science, you find things that are opposite to what traditionally people think, right? And that's okay. Components of your discussion. It should have the relationships, those results that you already stated what they were. It should point out if there's any limitations, if there are things that are not quite understood or unsettled points. It should be tied to previous work. That's where you use references to support your interpretations, right? You're making an argument for yourself, for your work. It should have theoretical implications. So you found this, so what, right? This is important because so-and-so. This would enable so-and-so. It should state conclusions clearly. So after you make your argument, you should flat out say, then this means that the protein changes shape, whatever, right? It should be clearly stated. And further of your evidence should be summarized for each of the conclusions, right? Again, you have a main idea, you have an argument, and you're supporting that argument with evidence, which is your data, right? And you're aiding that interpretation with literature of what is already known. So those are the components for each part. How do you write it? That goes into grammar and style, right? You have to be precise. You have to be very objective, right? You have to avoid personal and emotional feelings. And this sounds weird, but when you say things like, and I really don't love these kind of words, when you say highly efficient, what does that mean? Highly efficient. So you could say it improves by 25%, it something more quantitative, right? Just try to avoid ambiguous statements like that. And you'll see that there's a lot of that in there. Be very, very quantitative. So there's a little bit of controversy whether you should use the I or not. If you're the only author and you perform the work and you wrote the report, then it's I. You won't say we found, we believe. By the way, belief is also something you should never use in technical writing, right? Because it's subjective. You can use I, despite what some people think. If you're the only author, there's nobody else around, right? But you usually see in scientific literature that the scientific problems are so complex that more than one person work on it. So that's why they tend to use the we. So here are some examples. We wish to suggest a structure of the salt, and that's DNA, actually. And you'll see here that they're talking about a group, right? A we. That's actually the first time that they started to use talking in teams, right? You can use things like are. It depends on the people that are working on the work, right? How many people have contributed to this? So a lot of people try to not use the I, and the reason is because they want to remove themselves from the research. I think if you're a researcher, you want people to know that you did the work, right? But a lot of people want to remove themselves from the research to appear more objective or to avoid controversies and people just kind of going after them because they did something that was not very, I guess, accepted. Okay. The other big controversy about scientific writing is active and passive voice. I bet you were always told to write with a passive voice. There's a movement now in scientific writing of people that are using more the active voice. Why was the passive voice used? Precisely to remove the researcher from the picture. When we talk about active versus passive voice, we're really talking about how we position the subject and the verbs. So how do you choose from active or passive voice? You're going to decide whether you want the emphasis on the person, the subject or the verb. For example, a passive voice would be something like samples were collected from 6 countries, right? But then you're putting the emphasis on the samples. And then at the end, you're putting the emphasis on the research. While in the first sample of the active voice, you put the emphasis on we and then on the samples, right? So it's all about where you position one towards the other. Here are some examples of passive voice and active voice. And in these cases, all of them use I, right? So that's something that might be avoided. So you try to remove yourself from your writing. And most of the writing, scientific writing that you see is mostly in passive voice. Things like a qualitative method will be used, a content analysis process will be used, that type of thing. You want to remove yourself from that research. If not, if you want to put the emphasis on the researcher, that's where you will put something like this, active voice. So how do you decide? You want to decide on where you want to put the emphasis. So the active voice is something that is very direct, clear, and concise. And here's an example. The 3-day vaccinated animals, that's the subject. You're putting the emphasis on the subject, which is the animals, right? Express higher levels and yada, 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 right? So here in this case, the sentence is constructed in a way that you put the emphasis on the subject. Whereas this sample over here is passive voice, because the passive voice is indirect. Here, the emphasis is put on the what you did, were synthesized, and then the rest according to. So really, the way you write the sentence has to do with the emphasis that you want to put. Do you want to put it on the subject or you want to put it in the process? In the first sample, you're putting it on the subject, the vaccinated animals. In the second one, you're putting it in the process, which is the synthesis. So you are allowed to use active voice. It depends on where you want to emphasize in your writing. Verb tense. This is something that I struggle a lot with because I'm not a native speaker. So when we're doing these past tenses, we tend to put ed at the end of everything, and sometimes that's not correct, right? So here, for example, if you want the past of find is found, not founded. In this case, the past of detect is detected, so there you will put the ed. In this case here, increases instead of increased, ed. So this is a typical thing that we sometimes do. So when you're looking at the verb tense of your writings, make sure that you look it up to see, right, if the tense is right. I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm just gonna skip these. I can share the presentation with you guys later, because I do have some things that I want to show you before. Avoid being redundant. So repetition is good, but not too good for scientific writing, right? So avoid things like many numbers, blue in color. Blue is a color, so you don't have to tell me it's blue in color, right? Hydroxylation reaction, well, that's a reaction, right? So be careful of being redundant and repetitive. Here's the thing that I wanted to talk to you about in the scientific visuals, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So really, when you're drawing a figure, that's really the heart of the paper, because it's a way to convey your information in a really direct and orderly fashion, right? When you're thinking about the figures, make sure that the figures tell the story and tells you the main idea of your findings. I'm gonna go ahead and just gonna put this here. Okay, the figures should use a format that is very readable, right? And one of the common things that people tend to use is fonts that have like these little tails on the top. What that causes to the reader is that it's not very accessible because it kind of makes all the letters come together in a bunch. So try to use fonts that does not have those serif, right? That are non-serif fonts. Design your figures. Decide what's important, what goes in the paper, what does not go in the paper, goes in the supporting information. Try to reduce the number of panels. Sometimes you see figures that have a lot of panels in it, and it's really hard to follow. So just trying to minimize the amount of things that you put in there. Make sure that they're accurate. So the axis, that they have the units, can you read them? And then make sure you caption them. That's important too. How do you do the captions? So the success of having a good visual will depend on how you capture the scientific essence for a paper. So try to always describe what the figure is about, a sample description, and that includes also parameters of the conditions of the experiment, right? Because we need to know what the pH, what the temperature, what measurements were done. Know the difference between normalized, relative, and arbitrary. Sometimes I see arbitrary units and they're units that have been normalized, right? So make sure that you understand these terms. Define any symbols or acronyms. Do not overcrowd your figure. If you have a lot of traces, it will be very hard to understand what you're trying to say in that figure, right? Try to use colors that guide your eye, right? Don't use colors and different shapes, so squares. If you're gonna identify a trace, for example, doing just in one way. And nowadays we're advising that you can identify the different trace even if you don't print the paper in color, right? So that's something to think about. Cite any source that you took the figure from. So you'll see sometimes in reviews, you'll see a part that says adapted from, copyrighted from. If you took a figure that is not yours, make sure you give the correct credit and check for the captions in your figures. So here's our examples. This is a figure that's pretty clean, right? Identify I and 2, so 1 and 2, and it says what they are. It says the conditions, and in this particular case, it says that it was reproduced from. So that means that the figure is now originally from the authors of the paper, but they actually took it from someone else. This figure here is low resolution, so it's really hard to really see all the molecules in here. This figure has a bunch of panels. It's really hard to follow, right? Has a bunch of data, a bunch of panels, and all of them is cramped up. So we want to avoid this type of aesthetics. Another thing that's been talked about is the use of artificial intelligence and whether it will replace you. Spoiler alert, it will not replace you. A lot of authors nowadays are using AI tools to write papers, to write reports, and I want you guys to know that the journals know this and that the journals have a way to check for artificial intelligence generated tests. So, because of the increased use of ChatGPT, for example, journals are starting to have policies about this. And here's a summary of 3 of the most known journals. So the publisher for science, for example, Nature and Cell, they're already including in their policies how you should cite the use of artificial intelligence tests in your reports. So first thing you'll notice about all 3 policies, they don't recognize it as an author. And they do request that you state whether you used artificial intelligence to generate text. When you're publishing, make sure you check your journal policies to see what are the artificial intelligence guidelines for this. Now, a word of caution. ChatGPT is a great tool. It will not replace you. Your human mind made it. You're more intelligent than artificial intelligence. How do I know this? Well, I'm going to refer you from this article from ACS HSO. And I think it's really good because it summarizes a lot of studies. And from those studies, you can see that one of the things that they had done to just try to test these engines, right, is to ask them chemistry-related questions and see how accurate they are. So in one study, they found that artificial photosynthesis intelligence, I keep saying photosynthesis, that was my doctoral degree, that ChatGPT had an accuracy between 25% and 100%. That's a huge range. So it could be a 25% grade or 100% grade. That's a huge range, right? So that's something to be careful. The other thing that I had seen is that ChatGPT is really good with fats, for example. So what's the solubility of water, of things that are common, but it will not help you when you're trying to do application of knowledge or interpretation. And that is the reason why these tools will not replace you, because the human mind is the one that's able to have critical thinking, right? And to have problem-solving thinking. So these tools will not replace that skill that you have. However, they're helpful for writing and writing process and checking for grammar. And when you don't know what to write, you can actually input something and then verify it and just kind of help you organize your idea, right? But just know that is a tool and not something to replace you, okay? If you're more interested about this, there's a couple of references here, then later on I can go ahead and pass the presentation to you guys. So let's summarize. We already know what scientific writing is. We know what the significance and the purpose of it is. We know the key components. We know how to effectively structure it using the NRAD technique. We have familiarized ourselves with some writing styles and grammar. And I'll add one more. We already talked a little bit about, or mentioned a little bit about, the use of artificial intelligence in generating text and how the journals know that you're doing this. So there's policies associated with it. With that, I want to thank you for listening to me. I've been talking for an hour, so thank you for your attention. You can always write or just go ahead and follow me on Twitter to ask questions. I'll be happy to answer anything if you want. Thank you so much for listening to me.